Abigail Carter slammed her basket onto the kitchen table so hard, the clay bowl cracked clean across the center, and she stood there trembling, staring at her husband Samuel, while every word she'd swallowed for 3 years climbed up her throat at once. "You want me to stop?" she said. Her voice didn't shake. "Then you go tell those women out there their children won't eat tonight." Samuel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because outside the window, the garden he'd been so proud of was completely, utterly gone. If this story already has your heart, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now and follow this channel every week. I bring you stories about women who were underestimated, overlooked, and ultimately unbreakable. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Montana Territory. Summer of 1889. The sun had barely cleared the ridge when Abigail Carter was already moving through the wet grass along Willow Creek, her old woven basket tucked under one arm. Her thick fingers brushing the tops of plants most people in Willow Creek Valley wouldn't have been able to name at gunpoint. She wasn't pretty by the standards the valley held for pretty. She was broad across the shoulders, heavy through the hips, and strong in the way women get strong when nobody's ever coming to lift the load for them. She wore the same brown dress on most mornings because it was the dress that could take mud without complaint, and Abigail Carter had long since decided she had more respect for things that could survive hard use than things that merely looked fine hanging on a hook. She crouched near a stand of lamb's quarters and worked her fingers through the stems without breaking them, selecting only what she needed, the way old Nora Birdfeather had taught her when she was 16 years old and half dead from fever in the hills north of the reservation. That was 11 years ago. Most people in Willow Creek didn't know that story. Abigail had never told it to anyone except Samuel, and Samuel had listened politely the way a man listens when he's trying to love something he doesn't quite understand. She straightened up, shifted the basket to her other arm, and kept walking. Down the lane, she could already see the lights in the neighboring farmhouses beginning to glow. She knew what those women were doing. Eleanor Marsh would be standing at her kitchen window watching the garden rows she'd spent April and May perfectly planting, reassuring herself that the beans were filling out and the cabbages were the envy of the valley. Martha Collins would be doing the same from her back porch, probably already composing whatever cutting thing she planned to say the next time she spotted Abigail picking her way through the creekside brush. Martha Collins had never missed an opportunity. Abigail pressed her lips together and kept moving. She'd stopped being bothered by Martha Collins the way a river stops being bothered by a rock. The rock was still there. The river moved around it. That was the entire negotiation. What did bother her, what had been sitting at the back of her mind like a stone in a boot for the past 2 weeks, was the birds. She'd noticed it first on a Tuesday. Or maybe a Monday. She wasn't precisely sure of the date, only that she'd been walking the eastern stretch of the creek and realized at some point that the red-winged blackbirds had gone quiet. Not quiet the way they went quiet when a hawk came over. Quiet the way a room goes quiet when someone opens a door and the person standing in the doorway is carrying news nobody wants to hear. She'd stood still for a long time listening. No frogs. She'd dismissed it that first morning. Water temperature maybe. A change in the creek's behavior further upstream. But then the frogs were silent the second morning, and the third. And by the end of that first week, she'd noticed the grasshoppers were moving wrong, not jumping. Clustering at the bases of fence posts and rock walls like they were trying to get underneath something. She didn't say anything to Samuel. She didn't say anything to anyone, partly because she didn't know yet what she was reading, and partly because the last time she'd volunteered information to the women of Willow Creek, Eleanor Marsh had smiled at her with her teeth and said sweetly in front of 3 other women, "Abigail, you are the most unusual creature I believe I've ever had the pleasure of knowing." And every woman present had understood exactly what Eleanor Marsh meant by pleasure. So Abigail kept her eyes open and her mouth shut, and went on gathering her wild greens in the gray-gold mornings while the valley slept. She was coming back up the hill toward the house when she heard the screen door and Samuel's boots on the porch steps. He was already dressed. He'd been up before her, which meant something was occupying his mind. "You're out early," he said. "Same time I always go," she said. He looked at her basket. His face did something careful and controlled that she recognized. He was deciding whether to say a thing or leave it alone. "Martha Collins mentioned to Thomas that she'd seen you again," he said. "Down at the creek." "Martha Collins spends a great deal of time noticing where I am," Abigail said pleasantly. "Abigail." "Samuel." He put his hands in his pockets. He was a tall man, lean through the jaw, with the kind of face that looked most comfortable when it was being respected. He cared about his place in the valley, the way some men care about their good coat. It needed to look right at all times, especially in public. "I'm not asking you to stop," he said carefully. "I only wonder if perhaps you might collect your things a little earlier, before people are up." Abigail set her basket down on the porch railing and looked at her husband. "Samuel," she said, "I walk the creek at first light, because that's when the plants are at their best. If Martha Collins wants to rise before dawn to watch me do it, that's her business and her tired eyes." Samuel looked at the basket. He looked at the lamb's quarters and the cattail shoots and the little cluster of miner's lettuce she'd wrapped in a damp cloth. He opened his mouth. "It'll be in the eggs tonight," she said, "along with the last of the dried nettles. You won't taste the difference." He closed his mouth. He had never once in 7 years of marriage been able to argue with what came out of Abigail's kitchen. That was one of the many things that confused him about the whole situation. He loved her cooking. He loved her full stop, though he was not always graceful about showing it. He just wished with a kind of helpless, ongoing embarrassment that her cooking didn't come from a basket she'd filled by wading through creek mud before sunrise. He nodded and went back inside. Abigail picked up her basket and followed him. She set the lamb's quarters on the counter and began sorting them stem by stem. Her hands knew the work. Her mind went back to the grasshoppers. She'd seen a new behavior that morning. They weren't just clustering anymore. They were moving. Not all in one direction, but restless, purposeful, like water finding the edge of a container. She thought about the Cherokee word Nora Birdfeather used for that particular kind of movement. She could still hear the old woman's voice, low and unhurried, sitting beside a fire that smelled like pine pitch and sweetgrass. "Some things the land tells you before the thing happens," Nora had said. "The trick isn't hearing it. The trick is believing it before you have proof." Abigail believed it. She just didn't know yet what to do with the belief. She spent that day the way she spent most days, cooking, cleaning. Working the small kitchen garden she kept near the house. The one Samuel was more comfortable with because it looked like the gardens other wives kept, even if hers had a few peculiar additions tucked between the rows. In the afternoon, she walked the south end of the property line, checking the wild stands of purslane she'd been monitoring for the past month. They were full and healthy, good color. She pulled a small handful and chewed it standing there in the sun, thinking. The evening was quiet. Dinner was the eggs with lamb's quarters, a bread she'd made from a recipe she'd modified with a small addition of dried cattail pollen, and a pot of broth she'd been building for 3 days, with wild onions and the bones from last week's chicken. Samuel ate 2 bowls of the broth without comment, which for Samuel was the equivalent of a standing ovation. After dinner, he sat on the porch with his pipe, and she sat nearby mending a shirt, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was one of the underrated pleasures of a long marriage. "Thomas Marsh thinks we might get early rain," Samuel said eventually. Thomas Marsh thought last March's frost was finished by the 2nd week, Abigail said without looking up from the mending. A pause. "That's true," Samuel admitted. She set the shirt down in her lap. "Something's coming, Samuel." He turned his head. "I don't know what yet," she said. "But the birds left the east stretch of the creek 10 days ago and haven't come back. The frogs went quiet the same week, and the grasshoppers are moving like they're running from something." Samuel looked out at the dark valley. He was a practical man. He respected the land because he worked it every day, not because he read it the way Abigail read it, but he was not a stupid man. "What kind of something?" he said. "I don't know," she said again. "But I'm going to keep gathering everything I can find at the creek until I do." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. It was not an apology for that morning's conversation. Samuel was not built for apologies of that type. But it was acknowledgement, and for now, acknowledgement was enough. She picked up the shirt again. 3 days later, the sky turned. Abigail was on the porch before sunrise when she saw it, the light coming wrong. A brown-gray quality to the eastern horizon that had nothing to do with clouds. She stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up her basket and walked quickly toward the creek. Not because she thought she could stop anything, but because if what she thought was coming was actually coming, she needed to know exactly how much she had stored and where. She was halfway back from the creek, her basket full, when she heard the first sound. It was almost musical in the way thunder is almost music, a rhythm beneath the noise, a gathering vibration that she felt in her sternum before she heard it with her ears. She stopped walking. She turned south, and then she saw them. The cloud of beetles came over the ridge the way water comes over a dam, not all at once, but building the front edge dark and dense, and moving faster than she could track individually. Individual insects losing their separateness in the mass of the swarm, becoming instead a single terrible thing. She watched it for 3 seconds. Then she turned and ran for the house. "Samuel!" She was already shouting before she hit the porch steps. "Samuel, get up! Right now! Get up!" He appeared in the doorway in his undershirt, hair not yet combed, squinting at the light. "What in the beetles?" she said. "A full swarm. Over the south ridge." He pushed past her to look. She watched his face change. "Lord," he said quietly. "How much do we have stored?" she said. He turned. "What?" "In the root cellar. The dried goods. The preserves." "How much?" He ran a hand over his jaw. 3, maybe 4 months if we're careful. That garden will be gone by nightfall," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. "I know what's in the creek," she said. "I know what's in the hills, and along the south ridge, and in the abandoned homestead fields. None of it was planted. None of it is what those beetles are here for." She held up the basket. "This is what we have." Samuel stared at her basket with an expression she'd never quite seen on his face before. Something between humility and a kind of slow, quiet reckoning. The sound grew louder. Across the lane she could hear doors opening. Voices. Eleanor Marsh calling to her husband. The Henley children shouting from their yard. And then, unmistakably, Martha Collins's voice rising above all of them, shrill and suddenly frightened. "Robert? Robert, look at the garden." "Robert, they're in the garden already, Robert. What do we—" Her voice cut off. Abigail stood on her porch with her basket and her 7 years of mornings at the creek, and her 11 years of what old Nora Birdfeather had given her, and she watched the swarm descend on Willow Creek Valley the way a verdict descends on a courtroom. And she thought with a sorrow that had no satisfaction in it whatsoever, because she had never wanted to be right about this, not even a little. She thought, "I told you something was coming." She hadn't said those words to anyone. She said them now only to herself quietly. And then she set down the basket and went inside to start a fire, and begin making an inventory of everything she knew how to feed a family with when everything that had been planted was gone. By noon, the valley's gardens were devastated. Samuel stood at the edge of what had been his vegetable garden and said nothing for a very long time. The silence had a particular quality, the silence of a man revising his understanding of something he thought he already knew. He bent down once and picked up what remained of a bean plant. He held it, put it down. He came back to the house and found Abigail at the counter. "What can I do?" he said. She looked up. "Go ask Eleanor Marsh how many children they're feeding," she said. "And ask Thomas Marsh to ride to the Henley place and the Pruitt place and find out the same thing. Don't tell them what you're going to do. Just find out." He nodded. He put on his hat. He went. She turned back to the counter and kept working. The first knock on her door came that evening just before dark. It was Margaret Henley, 32 years old, with the youngest on her hip, and 2 older children pressed behind her knees and her eyes red from what might have been anger, or might have been weeping, or might have been both at once. "I heard you went to the creek this morning," Margaret said. Her voice was careful. I did, Abigail said. Thomas says... She stopped, started again. Some of the women are saying, Margaret, Abigail said. How many mouths are you feeding? A pause. 6, Margaret said. 7 if Thomas's brother comes back from Billings like he's planning. Abigail opened the door wider. Come in, she said. And bring those children off that porch. Margaret stepped inside. She looked at the counter. She looked at the things Abigail had laid out: the greens, the shoots, the roots, the dried bundles that hung from the kitchen rafters. She looked for a long moment. Are those weeds? She said. Some of them have that reputation, Abigail said. Margaret looked at her children, looked back at the counter. Can you feed them with that? I fed my husband with it this morning and he didn't notice the difference, Abigail said. Sit down. I'll show you. Margaret sat down. That was the first conversation. There would be hundreds more before the summer was finished, and every single one of them would begin the same way, with a woman standing in a doorway, embarrassed and desperate, swallowing whatever she'd said about Abigail Carter in the past, because her children needed to eat, and the woman with the woven basket was the only person in the valley who had known this was coming and had spent 11 years preparing for it anyway. Abigail never said I told you so. She never even let the thought linger. She simply moved aside, opened the door wider and said, Come in, let me show you what the land has been offering us all along. Outside the beetles moved on, and the creek ran quietly on as it always had, indifferent to the pride and the hunger and the long, difficult lesson that Willow Creek Valley was only just beginning to learn. Margaret Henley left Abigail's kitchen that night carrying a cloth bundle of dried lamb's quarters, a handful of cattail shoots wrapped in a damp rag, and instructions she'd made Abigail repeat twice because she couldn't believe something that simple could actually feed her children. She came back the next morning with her sister-in-law. That was how it started. Not with a proclamation, not with Samuel riding through the valley announcing his wife's knowledge. It started the way most important things start, with one woman embarrassed and hungry, telling another woman in private, and that woman telling another, and so on quietly, the way water moves underground before it ever breaks the surface. Abigail didn't sleep much in those first days after the swarm. She was up before light, walking the creek, walking the hillside, walking the old abandoned homestead trails that most people in the valley avoided, because the land there was considered spent. She knew better. Abandoned land was often the richest land, because nobody had been managing it into submission. The purslane there grew thick as carpet. The wood sorrel came up between every crack in the old stone fence line. She moved through it all with her basket, and her quick hands working twice as fast as she ever had before, because she was no longer gathering only for herself and Samuel. She was gathering for a valley. She calculated as she worked. 15 families she knew of within a reasonable distance. Some of them larger. The Pruitt family alone had 9 children, which made Abigail's chest tighten every time she thought about it. Old Widow Garner, who lived at the end of the North Road, had no family nearby, and would not ask for help under any circumstances Abigail could currently imagine, which meant help would need to arrive at her door without being framed as help. Abigail was already thinking about how to do that. Samuel found her in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, 2 days after the swarm, standing at the counter, with her eyes closed, lips moving slightly, going through something in her head. Abigail. She opened her eyes. I need more jars, she said immediately. And I need to borrow Eleanor Marsh's salt crock, the big one. Samuel stared at her. It's 4 in the morning. I know what time it is. I need the jars before the week's out. And I need to show at least 3 women how to dry nettles before Thursday, because if we don't start preserving now, we'll lose the window. He sat down in the kitchen chair slowly, the way a man sits when he's realized the world has changed around him while he was sleeping. What can I do? He said. Talk to Thomas Marsh, she said. He doesn't trust anything that didn't come out of a plowed row. But he'll listen to you before he listens to me, and I need his wagon on Saturday to take a group out to the South Ridge. What's on the South Ridge? Everything, she said. Now go back to sleep. I'll be in before sunrise. He went back to sleep. He did not question the jars. He spoke to Thomas Marsh the following morning, and Thomas Marsh showed up at the Carter property on Saturday with his wagon and a face that communicated considerable skepticism, while simultaneously communicating that he was willing to keep his mouth shut about it, which Abigail considered a sufficient starting point. The women who came on that first Saturday were not the women Abigail would have predicted. Margaret Henley came, which she'd expected. Agnes Pruitt came huge and exhausted and frightened in a way she was barely managing to conceal 9 children's worth of fear sitting just behind her eyes. There was a younger woman named Clara Bright, who Abigail knew only slightly. She'd married into the valley the previous autumn, barely 20 years old, still learning the rhythms of the place. And then, to Abigail's genuine surprise, there was Ruth Garner, the old widow from the end of the North Road. She was standing at the edge of the group when Abigail came out of the house upright and fierce, and wearing her best going-to-town dress, as if she wanted to make absolutely clear that she was attending this by choice and not by need. She had a basket over one arm that looked like it hadn't been used in 20 years. Abigail met her eyes. Ruth Garner gave a single sharp nod. Abigail nodded back and said nothing at all about it, which was the correct response, and they both knew it. Thomas Marsh drove them out to the South Ridge without speaking much, though Abigail caught him looking sideways at the group of women in his wagon with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between bafflement and something almost tender, which she suspected he would have been embarrassed to have attributed to him. When they reached the ridge, Abigail climbed down from the wagon and turned to face them. "I'm going to show you 3 things today," she said. "I'm going to show you how to find them, how to tell them from what will hurt you, and how to take only what you need, so there's still something here next week. That third part matters as much as the first 2. You take everything today, there's nothing tomorrow. We're not raiding this land, we're in a relationship with it." Agnes Pruitt's youngest, who'd apparently come along and was old enough to follow, said, "Mama, is this like farming?" Agnes started to shush him. "Different kind," Abigail said. "Farming is you telling the land what to grow. This is you listening to what it already decided." The boy thought about that. What if the land decided wrong? In 11 years, Abigail said it hasn't. She taught them lamb's quarters first because it was everywhere and unmistakable. She put a leaf in Ruth Garner's palm and made her look at it for a full 30 seconds before she told her what it was. "Why are we staring at it?" Ruth said. "Because the next time you see it, your hands will remember before your brain does," Abigail said. "That's how it works. You learn it in your hands, not your head." Ruth stared at the leaf with the focused intensity of a woman who had decided to be excellent at this, whatever this turned out to be. Then Abigail showed them purslane, the thick succulent stems, the small rounded leaves, the way it held water inside itself, the way the land held it in reserve. "You can eat this raw," she said. "Right now. Pick a piece." Clara Bright picked a small piece and looked at it like it might do something unexpected. "Clara," Abigail said, "I'm going to eat it, Clara ate it. Her eyebrows went up. "It tastes like—" She stopped. "It actually tastes like something." "Lemony," Agnes said, who had already eaten hers without ceremony, because Agnes Pruitt was not a woman who hesitated when there was information to be gathered. "A bit lemony, and—" She chewed. "Almost like something's been added to it." "Nothing's been added to it," Abigail said. "That's just what it tastes like. The land didn't need our improvement." That sentence landed on the group in a particular way. Abigail saw it move across their faces and didn't comment on it. They worked the ridge for 3 hours. By the time Thomas Marsh drove them back down toward the valley, every basket was full, and Ruth Garner had stopped wearing her going-to-town expression and was wearing instead the focused, quiet look of a woman who was filing away information as fast as it was arriving. On the drive back, Agnes Pruitt said quietly, "Abigail, how long have you known about all of this?" "About 11 years, Abigail said. A silence. "Why didn't you ever—" Agnes stopped. "I tried once," Abigail said. "The spring after I arrived in the valley. I showed Eleanor Marsh 3 plants I thought might be useful additions to her garden. She thanked me very politely and told her husband I'd suggested she eat grass. A longer silence. Eleanor Marsh is a fool, Agnes said. Eleanor Marsh is a frightened woman who measures her safety in what's familiar, Abigail said. Right now, she's a frightened woman who's going to need feeding. Agnes was quiet for a moment. You're going to feed her anyway, aren't you? Of course I am, Abigail said. Ruth Garner, who had not spoken since the ridge, said from the back of the wagon without looking up from her basket, I want to come again next week. Thomas Marsh cleared his throat loudly, which from Thomas Marsh Abigail had come to understand was equivalent to emotional agreement. That was the second day. On the third day, something shifted in the valley that Abigail hadn't anticipated, which meant she should have anticipated it, because she'd seen it happen before in smaller forms, the moment when survival starts feeling less desperate, and the old social hierarchies try to reassert themselves before anyone's had time to fully understand that those hierarchies are the reason everyone nearly starved to begin with. It came in the form of Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor arrived at Abigail's door mid-morning, dressed as if she were calling on a neighbor in ordinary times, which is to say, dressed better than the situation required, which is to say, dressed as armor. Abigail, she said when Abigail opened the door. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who has rehearsed an opening line. I wanted to speak with you about the arrangements you've been making with some of the other women in the valley. Abigail stepped aside to let her in. Eleanor came in and stood in the kitchen and looked at the counter and the dried bundles and the jars with a face that was working very hard to remain neutral. I think, Eleanor said carefully, that it might be more organized if the distribution of whatever you've been finding were centralized. Through the church hall, perhaps, or through a committee. Abigail filled the kettle and put it on. What sort of committee? Well, the minister could head it, of course, and perhaps Thomas Marsh, since he's been driving, and she paused. It's just that some of the women feel that the current arrangement is a bit, another pause, informal. The current arrangement, Abigail said, is that women come to me when they're ready, and I teach them what I know. Yes, but surely it would be more respectable. Eleanor. Abigail turned from the kettle and looked at her directly. How much food do you have in your root cellar? A pause. We have some? Eleanor said stiffly. For how long? A shorter pause. 6 weeks perhaps, possibly 8 if we're careful. And after 8 weeks, the silence that followed was a very specific kind of silence. The silence of a woman who had spent the last 3 days telling herself the situation wasn't as serious as other people were making it, and who was now in a warm kitchen with a direct question hanging in the air, having to stop telling herself that story. I don't know, Eleanor said quietly. Abigail poured the hot water into 2 cups and set one in front of Eleanor. This is dried nettle tea, she said. It tastes like green hay the first time and like something you can't live without by the third. Sit down. Eleanor sat. She wrapped both hands around the cup. She looked at it. She didn't drink immediately. I mocked you, she said. Didn't I? For years. Yes, Abigail said. Eleanor absorbed that. I told my husband you were peculiar. You told him I suggested you eat grass, Abigail said, which was an overstatement. Eleanor's mouth tightened. Whether from shame or old defensiveness, Abigail couldn't tell. Perhaps both. And now, Eleanor said, you're feeding half the valley with what you learned at that creek. Not yet, Abigail said. But we're working on it. Eleanor looked up. Why would you help me, after everything? Eleanor. Abigail's voice was even and unhurried. I'm not helping you. I'm teaching you. There's a difference. Help ends when I stop coming. What I'm teaching you, you'll still have when I'm gone. Eleanor stared at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the cup and drank. She made a face. It does taste like hay. Give it a 3rd cup, Abigail said. That was the 3rd day. By the end of the 1st week, Abigail had organized what she thought of privately as her 2nd classroom, the first being the hillside and the creek and the ridge. the second being her own kitchen, where 3 mornings a week she gathered whatever women were willing to come and went through preservation techniques that Nora Birdfeather had passed to her drying pickling in wild brine slow-cooking roots into a paste that kept for months smoking certain stems over a low fire until they became something dense and calorie-rich that could be ground into a course meal. Martha Collins had not come. This fact sat in Abigail's awareness the way an untended wound sits in a body not crippling, not yet infected, but not nothing either. Martha Collins was the loudest voice in Willow Creek Valley and had been for 15 years. Where Martha Collins went, opinion followed, and right now, Martha Collins was doing something more dangerous than mocking Abigail openly. She was being quiet. Quiet Abigail had learned was often louder than noise. She found out why on a Thursday afternoon when Clara Bright appeared at the kitchen door with a particular expression on her face, the expression of someone who is about to deliver information they'd rather not be the one delivering. "Martha Collins has been speaking to some of the men," Clara said. Abigail kept sorting the day's harvest. "Saying what?" Clara looked at her hands. "That what you've been doing is admirable, she supposes, but that a woman without proper training shouldn't be the one advising other women's families on what to eat." She said. Clara stopped. "Clara." She said there's no proof any of what you know is trustworthy, and that the Valley is taking your word on blind faith. Abigail's hand stopped. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up a stem of purslane and looked at it. "Whose children have gotten sick?" she said. Clara blinked. "What? From anything I've taught or given. Whose children have gotten sick?" "Nobody's," Clara said. "Whose families are going to bed hungry?" "Nobody's," Clara said again more quietly. "That I know of." "All right," Abigail said. She set the purslane down. "What else did she say?" Clara hesitated. "That perhaps a doctor should come and verify which plants are actually safe before anyone eats more of them." Abigail looked at Clara steadily. "The nearest doctor is 40 miles east. How long do Martha Collins's children go without eating while we wait for a man from 40 miles away to look at lamb's quarters?" Clara opened her mouth, closed it. "Tell me something," Abigail said. "Have you eaten what I've given you?" "Every day this week." "And your husband?" "Every meal." "And you both feel?" "We feel fine," Clara said. "Better than fine. James said he hasn't had energy like this in years." "Then you already have your verification," Abigail said. "You've been running it for 5 days." Clara was quiet, and then something resolved in her face, something that had been uncertain settled into something decided. "What do you want me to do?" she said. "Nothing," Abigail said. "You don't need to fight Martha Collins for me. Go home and feed your husband." She picked up the purslane again. "The plants don't care about Martha Collins's opinion. Neither do I." Clara went home. But the thing that Martha Collins had started with her quiet comments was already moving through the valley, and Abigail knew it, and she worked faster. She sent Samuel to the Pruitt place with a week's worth of dried goods and 2 jars of preserved wild onion because Agnes had too many children and too much pride to keep coming back to ask. She taught Ruth Garner how to identify the difference between wood sorrel and false oxalis, the one that would make you sick, and she did it 3 times until Ruth could do it with her eyes half closed. She showed Clara Bright's husband James how to build a simple drying rack because the women couldn't do everything, and the men needed to understand that this work was work the same as any other work the Valley valued. James Bright built the drying rack. Then he built one for the Pruitt family. Then, without being asked, he built one for Ruth Garner and left it at her gate with no note attached. That was the 4th day of the 2nd week, and it was also the day something happened that Abigail had not planned for and would not have been able to predict, which was that old Thomas Marsh, skeptical, quiet wagon driving. Thomas Marsh, who had never once in Abigail's knowledge expressed an opinion about anything she did, came to the Carter property in the late afternoon and knocked on the front door instead of calling from the gate. Samuel answered it. Abigail heard them talking in the front room and came to the doorway. Thomas Marsh held his hat in both hands. He was a raw-boned man in his late 50s, weathered the way good fence posts get weathered, not weakened, just worn into their final form. He looked at Abigail. "I wanted to ask you," he said, "about the cattail. You showed Agnes how to get the flour from it. I was wondering if you could show me." Abigail looked at him. "Me specifically," he said, "not the group. I want to know how to do it myself. I have 6 grandchildren living across the ridge, and I want to be able to teach them." Abigail was quiet for a beat. "Come to the kitchen," she said. "I have some drying right now." Good timing. Thomas Marsh sat in Abigail's kitchen for 2 hours that afternoon, learning cattail processing with the same focused attention he brought to everything mechanical. Asking precise questions and taking what Abigail told him seriously, in the way that some people are incapable of doing until the lesson is delivered by a particular kind of authority. And Thomas Marsh had somewhere in the past 2 weeks decided that Abigail Carter was that kind of authority. When he left, he stopped in the doorway and turned back. "Martha Collins," he said. Abigail waited. "She's scared," he said. "That's all. She's always been scared of things she doesn't understand, and she covers it with noise. Eleanor Marsh figured that out 20 years ago, and that's why Eleanor's easier to live with than she used to be." He put his hat on. "I thought you ought to know." Abigail nodded. He left. Samuel appeared from the hallway. "What was that about Martha Collins?" "Nothing I didn't already know," Abigail said. But that night, lying in the dark, listening to Samuel breathe, she thought about Martha Collins with something that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite pity, and was maybe something that had no exact name, an understanding of how fear works in a person, how it twists their thinking without them realizing the twist is happening, how it makes them attack the thing they need most because needing something feels like weakness. Martha Collins was afraid. Abigail understood afraid. She'd been afraid herself plenty of times. She'd been afraid as a 16-year-old lost in the hills north of the reservation, fever burning through her, too weak to stand, until Nora Birdfeather found her and sat beside her for 3 days, and brought the fever down with things she pulled from the earth around them. She'd been afraid in the early years of her marriage, when she'd felt the distance between who she was and what the valley expected her to be, and hadn't yet understood that the distance was not a flaw in her, it was a flaw in the measurement. She'd turned that fear into knowledge. She'd walked it out of her system every morning at the creek. She didn't know how to give Martha Collins that particular education. She wasn't sure it was hers to give. But she thought about it lying there in the dark, and she thought about Thomas Marsh saying she covers it with noise, and she thought about what might happen when noise ran out of fuel. She found out sooner than she expected. The illness hit 8 days after the swarm. It wasn't widespread one family. The Wheelers, a young couple with 3 children and a 4th on the way. The youngest Wheeler boy developed a fever late on a Friday, and by Saturday morning he was shaking hard enough that his mother, Mary Wheeler, had wrapped him in every blanket in the house and was sitting beside him with the particular stillness of a woman who is controlling her terror by refusing to move. Mary Wheeler had come to 2 of Abigail's kitchen mornings. She'd been quiet, attentive, careful with her questions. Abigail liked her. Samuel heard about the sick child from James Bright and told Abigail that afternoon. Abigail took her medicine basket, a separate basket smaller, that she kept specifically for what Nora had taught her about fevers and infection, and walked to the Wheeler place. Mary Wheeler let her in without hesitation. Abigail looked at the boy. He was 5 years old, flushed, dark with fever, breathing fast. She put her hand to his forehead and his neck and checked his eyes and the inside of his lower lip the way Nora had taught her. "He's been drinking from the creek," she said. Mary Wheeler's hand went to her mouth. Not the main creek," she said. "The South Branch, the one near the old Kellerman property." Abigail kept her voice level. "The South Branch runs through the old Kellerman lower field." "Yes." "There were cattle penned in that lower field all spring." Mary Wheeler made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "This is a water fever," Abigail said. "It's not from the food. Do you understand me? It is not from anything you've eaten or been taught. It's from the water. Which branch has he been drinking from? I didn't know he was going to the creek. He's 5. He goes everywhere. I can't watch him Mary Wheeler's voice broke. Mary? Abigail's voice was firm and warm at once. Listen to me. I need to boil water, clean water from the main creek. And I need you to tell me if you have any dried elderberries left from last summer. Yes, I think in the pantry. Go get them. Mary went. Abigail worked through the afternoon and into the evening rotating cool cloths, giving the boy small amounts of the elderberry preparation Nora had used for fevers, making sure he was drinking clean water and keeping it down. She sent Samuel, who had come along without being asked, to the main creek with the clean water jug. She told Mary Wheeler 3 times in different ways that this fever was survivable, that the boy was strong, that they had caught it early enough, and she meant every word of it, because she believed it, and believing it made her voice steady, and Mary Wheeler's breathing slowed every time Abigail spoke steadily. By 10 o'clock at night, the fever broke. Not all the way it would come and go for another 2 days. But it broke enough that the boy stopped shaking, and Mary Wheeler sat back in her chair and put her hands over her face and made no sound for a long time. Abigail packed her smaller basket. I'll come back tomorrow morning, she said. Keep him on the clean water and the elderberry. No South Branch water for any of your children. Not until the summer's drier. Mary lowered her hands. Her eyes were red and her face was wet, and she looked at Abigail with the specific expression of a person who doesn't have language for what they're feeling and knows that whatever language exists won't be sufficient anyway. Thank you, she said. It came out barely above a whisper. Get some sleep, Abigail said. I mean it. She and Samuel walked home in the dark, not talking much. The night air, dry and smelling of dust, and the distant sweetness of wild bergamot that grew along the upper pasture fence. He's going to be fine, Samuel said. He is, Abigail said. You knew what it was right away. I've seen it before, she said. In the reservation settlements, water contamination from livestock. It follows a pattern. Samuel was quiet for a little while. You've seen a lot of things, he said. I have, she said. I didn't know, he said. How much I didn't know. He said it the way a man says something he's been assembling slowly for a while and has finally built into a sentence. Not an apology. Samuel wasn't built for apologies, as she well knew. But it was true, and he said it plainly, and that counted for something real between them. She reached over and took his arm as they walked. He let her keep it. That was the night the Wheeler boys' fever broke. The next morning, before Abigail had finished her first hour at the creek, the rumor was already in the air. She heard it first from Clara Bright, who appeared on the path at 7 in the morning, with her hair still not fully pinned and her boots unlaced at the top, which told Abigail she'd dressed quickly and come straight over. Martha Collins is telling people the Wheeler boy got sick from your food, Clara said. She wasn't gentle about it. There was no gentle way to say it, and Clara Bright had learned in the last 2 weeks that Abigail preferred the direct version. Abigail stood at the creek with her basket. She was quiet for a moment. Who has she told? She said. She was at the general store when I came through, Clara said. She was talking to Bill Hennessy and the Pruitt brothers, not Agnes's husband, the other Pruitt brothers, the ones from the North Road. What exactly did she say? Clara pressed her lips together. She said the boy got sick right after his mother started using the things you'd been teaching. She said it was too much of a coincidence and that someone with real medical training needed to be involved before any more of us put our children at risk. Abigail looked at the creek. A long moment passed. Then she picked a stem of watercress, checked it, added it to the basket, and straightened up. Clara, she said. Who was at the store when Martha was saying this? Bill Hennessy, the Pruitt brothers, Jim Carver from the livery. A pause. And Thomas Marsh. Abigail turned. Thomas Marsh was there. He was standing near the door, Clara said. He didn't say anything while I was there, but he was listening. Abigail looked at the basket. She looked at the creek. She thought about a 5-year-old boy with a broken fever sleeping in clean blankets right now, and his mother, who'd thanked her in a voice barely above a whisper. She thought about Martha Collins standing in Bill Hennessy's store, constructing a story out of coincidence and fear. And she thought about how easy it was to build something convincing from those two materials, and how a story built from fear moved faster than a story built from truth. She thought about Nora Birdfeather, who had spent 40 years healing people in the hills north of the reservation and who had never once been formally credited for a single life she'd saved, because she was an old Cherokee woman and not a man with a certificate. "All right," Abigail said. She picked up her basket. "Let's go home," she said. "I have preserving to do." Clara stared at her. You're just going to—" "I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing," Abigail said, "because the families who are eating and healthy are a more convincing argument than anything I could say at Bill Hennessy's store." She started walking. "And because the Wheeler boy needs his elderberry this morning, and I promised Mary I'd be there before 9. Clara stood for a moment in the path. Then she picked up her own basket, the small one she'd started carrying in the mornings when she joined Abigail at the creek, and followed. What neither of them knew yet. Walking together through the early morning toward a valley that was drawing its breath for something harder, what neither of them could have seen coming was that Martha Collins was not done, not even close to done, and that the valley was about to make a choice that would cost it something it might never fully get back. The rumor moved through Willow Creek the way fire moves through dry grass, not in a straight line, not with any single point of origin you could put your finger on, but spreading outward in all directions at once, finding fuel wherever it found fear, and in the days following the Wheeler boy's illness, fear was everywhere. Martha Collins had not invented the story from nothing. That was the part that made it so effective. She had taken real pieces. The boy's fever, the timing, the unfamiliar plants, the fact that Abigail Carter had no medical certificate on her wall and no formal credentials anyone could point to, and she had arranged those pieces into a shape that looked at a certain angle like evidence. That was the difference between a lie and a rumor. A lie was something invented. A rumor was something real, rearranged. By Monday morning, 3 families had stopped coming to the kitchen sessions. By Tuesday, Clara Bright arrived at the creek path with her mouth set and her eyes tight, and told Abigail that Agnes Pruitt's husband Harold had told Agnes she was not to take the children to the Carter property until the whole situation was sorted out, and Agnes had fought him on it, and they'd had the worst argument of their 8-year marriage, and Agnes had lost. Abigail kept walking the creek. She kept filling her basket. She delivered dried goods to Ruth Garner's gate on Wednesday without knocking because Ruth Garner would accept a bundle left silently at her gate in a way she might not accept the same bundle handed to her face to face. On Thursday she went to the Wheeler place and checked the boy whose fever had fully broken by then, who was sitting up and eating, and looked, as Mary Wheeler said with wet eyes, entirely like himself again. On Friday, an anonymous letter appeared under Abigail's door. It was written on plain paper in a hand she didn't recognize, though she had her suspicions. It said in careful, deliberate letters that the writer and several concerned neighbors felt it was irresponsible for any woman without proper training to be advising families on food and medicine during a crisis, and that if she continued, they would have no choice but to contact the county health authority and request an official inquiry. Samuel found her reading it at the kitchen table. He took it from her hands, read it, and set it down very carefully with the controlled precision of a man who is keeping a tighter grip on himself than he usually needs to. "Who wrote this?" he said. "I don't know for certain," Abigail said. "I have a strong opinion," he said. "So do I," she said. "It doesn't change anything." Samuel looked at her. "Abigail, they're threatening to bring in the county." "Let them," she said. "That's not, you can't just—" "Samuel." She folded the letter in half and set it on the far edge of the table like it was a thing of no particular importance. "The county health authority is 40 miles away. By the time anyone rode there and made a formal complaint, and someone rode back, another 3 weeks will have passed. 3 more weeks of families eating what I've been teaching them to eat. 3 more weeks of nobody getting sick from the food." She looked at him. "Let them write to the county. I'll still be at the creek at first light." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He laced his hands together on the table and looked at them. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. I've been talking to some of the men," he said. "Thomas Marsh, James Bright, Harold Pruitt before this business with Agnes." He paused. "There are men in this valley who think what you've been doing is the reason half their families are still eating. Who know it, and they haven't said so publicly because—" He stopped. "Because it would mean admitting their wives were right to come to me," Abigail said. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Yes," he said. "That's the honest answer." She looked at her husband. She looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who worked hard and meant well, and had spent 7 years loving her imperfectly, but genuinely, and she felt for him the specific tenderness you feel for a person who is in the middle of understanding something difficult about themselves. "I know," she said. "I should have said something sooner," he said. "Publicly. I should have—" "Samuel." He looked up. "You're saying it now," she said. He was quiet. Then he nodded, once the short, decisive nod of a man who has made up his mind about something. "What do you need me to do?" he said. She thought for a moment. "Nothing yet," she said. "But when the moment comes, I'll tell you. And I need you to be ready to move fast." He nodded again. She picked up the folded letter, walked to the stove, and dropped it in. The moment she'd referenced came faster than either of them expected. It came on a Saturday, at the community meeting, that Robert Collins, Martha's husband, had called in the church hall. Robert Collins was not a bad man. He was a careful man, a man who measured his words and his movements by what was socially acceptable. And what was socially acceptable, right now in his reading of Willow Creek Valley, was to be seen taking the community's concerns seriously. He'd posted the notice at the general store, and at the livery, and at the church door. Meeting at 3 o'clock. All welcome. Regarding community health and food safety during the current crisis. Abigail knew what it was. She went anyway. She went because not going would have been interpreted as guilt, and she was not guilty, and she did not intend to behave as if she were. She put on her second-best dress, which was not her going-to-town dress, but was clean and well-pressed, and she asked Samuel to drive her, which he did without a word, sitting beside her on the wagon seat, with the settled quiet of a man who has decided which side of something he is on. The church hall was full when they arrived. Not every family in the valley. There were some who hadn't come, who Abigail noted privately and would think about later. But most of them. Rows of faces, some familiar and sympathetic, some carefully neutral, some that she could read as hostile, even from the door. Martha Collins was already seated in the front row, which was not a coincidence. Robert Collins stood at the front with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had organized something that had taken on a life he hadn't fully anticipated. He cleared his throat twice before the room settled. "I want to thank everyone for coming," he said. This isn't meant to be adversarial. We're all facing the same difficulties here, and we want to address some concerns that have been raised about safety." "Whose safety?" Thomas Marsh said from the third row. His voice was flat and even. Robert Collins looked at him. "Everyone's safety, Thomas." "Because as far as I've seen," Thomas Marsh said, "the only families in this valley who haven't gone to bed hungry in the past 2 weeks are the ones who've been learning from Abigail Carter. So I want to be specific about whose safety we're protecting before we start protecting it." A murmur moved through the room. Martha Collins turned in her seat. "Thomas?" "Nobody is questioning the generosity of what Abigail has tried to do. We are questioning whether it's safe, whether she has the knowledge to be advising families, advising children on what to put in their bodies." She paused. "The Wheeler boy got sick." "The Wheeler boy drank from a contaminated water source," Abigail said. The room went quiet. She hadn't stood up. She was still seated 2 rows back with her hands in her lap. She hadn't raised her voice. She said it the way you say a fact plainly, without decoration, with the confidence of someone who was there and knows what happened. Martha turned to face her. "We only have your word for that." "You have Mary Wheeler's word for it," Abigail said. "She's sitting 4 rows behind me. You could ask her directly." Heads turned. Mary Wheeler, who had come to this meeting with her jaw set and her recovered boy sitting beside her, holding her hand, met the room's gaze steadily. "The contamination came from the south branch of the creek," Mary said. Her voice was quiet but clear. "My boy had been drinking from it without my knowing. Abigail told me what it was within 10 minutes of looking at him. And he's sitting here next to me right now because she came to my house and stayed most of the night." She paused. "I don't have anything else to say about that." The murmur in the room shifted quality. It was the same sound, but different, the same number of voices, but the tone had changed from collective uncertainty to something more divided. Martha Collins turned back to the front. "Even so," she said, "I think most reasonable people would agree that we should have a proper medical authority." "Martha." Eleanor Marsh's voice came from the left side of the room. Everyone looked at Eleanor Marsh because Eleanor Marsh was not a woman who spoke up in public forums. She organized, and she managed, and she directed from the side, but she did not take the floor. The fact that she was taking it now communicated something significant to everyone in that room who knew her, which was everyone. Eleanor stood up from her chair. She was wearing her best dress, which meant she had planned this, which meant she had thought about this considerably before walking into this room. "I have something I need to say," she said. "And I need to say it publicly because I said the other things publicly, or at least in ways that became public, and it's only right." She paused. She did not look at Abigail when she said the next part, which told Abigail this was costing her something real. "I have mocked Abigail Carter for years, in this valley among these neighbors. I have implied she was peculiar, that her habits were an embarrassment, that her husband should be, that Samuel should be embarrassed by her." Another pause. "I was wrong. And I was wrong in a way that if this crisis had come 6 months earlier, before I'd been forced by circumstances to sit in her kitchen and learn from her, might have cost my family our food this summer." She looked up. "She taught me anyway. She taught me after everything I'd said. She didn't ask me to apologize. She made me tea and showed me what lamb's quarters looks like." Eleanor's voice did something it didn't usually do. "I think most of us in this room owe Abigail Carter a debt that a community meeting doesn't come close to covering." The silence that followed was the deepest silence Abigail had sat inside of in a long time. And then Robert Collins said quietly, "Is there anything else anyone wants to—" "Yes." Harold Pruitt stood up from the back. Harold Pruitt, who had told Agnes she was not allowed to take the children to the Carter property. Harold Pruitt, who Agnes had fought and lost to. He stood with his hat in his hands, and he did not look comfortable, but he stood. "My wife has been providing food for our 9 children with what she's learned from Abigail Carter. I told her to stop 2 weeks ago because I was worried. She argued with me." He paused. "She was right and I was wrong, and I want that said in front of this room." Something broke open in the hall then. Not loudly. There was no dramatic moment, no single voice that split the atmosphere. It broke the way ice breaks in early spring, quietly at first, one crack following another, the structure giving way from within. Martha Collins stood. Her face was composed, but Abigail had been watching her for 2 weeks, and she could see what was underneath the composure now. Thomas Marsh had been right. It was fear, pure and specific and real. "I'm not the villain in this room," Martha said. "Nobody said you were," Abigail said. Martha looked at her. "I said nobody here is sick from my food," Abigail said. "I said the Wheeler boys' fever came from contaminated water. I said the families who've been learning are eating and healthy. I haven't said a single word about you, Martha. Not here and not anywhere else." She paused. "What you've been saying about me is something you'll have to work out on your own terms. That's not my jurisdiction." Martha stared at her. Her composure held. But something behind it shifted the way a load shifts on a wagon when the road changes grade, and for just a moment, the fear was entirely visible, raw, and unmediated. The fear of a woman who had organized her sense of the world around a particular hierarchy and was watching that hierarchy become irrelevant in real time. "My children are hungry," Martha said. It came out much smaller than anything else she'd said. It came out like a confession. The room was very still. Abigail looked at her for a moment. And then she said in the same level voice she'd used for everything else, "I know. Come to my kitchen on Monday morning. Bring the children." Martha Collins sat down. Robert Collins closed the meeting. People filed out in a way that was quieter and more thoughtful than the way they'd filed in. And Abigail sat in her seat until the room had mostly emptied, and Samuel sat beside her. And at one point, he put his hand briefly over hers on the bench, and then moved it back to his own lap, which from Samuel was a complete declaration. But the meeting was not the end of it. That was what Abigail had not yet understood, or perhaps had understood, and refused to fully account for. Which was that public moments don't resolve private wounds, and that Martha Collins's fear exposed in that church hall did not disappear because it had been seen. It changed shape. The following week was different from the first two. The group of women coming to her kitchen in the mornings grew, not shrank. Martha Collins came on Monday, as Abigail had invited, with two of her children, and sat at the table with the precise manner of someone submitting to a procedure they'd decided to endure with dignity. She was not warm. But she came, and she paid attention, and when Abigail showed her the purslane, her hands repeated the motion correctly the first time. "You learn fast," Abigail said. Martha did not smile. "I do most things fast when I decide to do them," she said. "I just take longer to decide than I should." It was the closest thing to an apology Martha Collins was going to offer, and Abigail recognized it for what it was and accepted it without ceremony, which was the only way Martha Collins could have accepted the acceptance. But the unsigned letters didn't stop. Two more appeared that week, one under Abigail's door in the night. One delivered to the general store addressed to several of the Valley's men, unsigned, suggesting that the community's reliance on one woman's knowledge was dangerous, precisely because of what happened if that one woman was wrong, or worse, deliberately misleading them. Abigail read the second one, because Bill Hennessy brought it to her directly. He'd found it on his counter in the morning, and didn't know what to do with it, and had decided bringing it to Abigail was better than leaving it where anyone could pick it up. She read it standing in his store. She handed it back. "Burn it or keep it," she said. "Your choice." "Who do you think wrote it?" Bill said. "I think there's more than one person whose handwriting that could be," she said. "And I also think that whoever wrote it is eating better this week than they were 2 weeks ago, so the argument has some practical contradictions built into it." Bill Hennessy looked at her. He was a short, round-faced man who had run the general store for 23 years and had the specific exhaustion of someone who served as the emotional center of a community without ever having been elected to the position. "What I want to know," he said, "is how you're still standing up straight." She looked at him. "With all of it," he said. "The letters, Martha, the meeting. You keep going to that creek and teaching those women and you don't—" He shook his head. "I'd have lost my temper by day 3. "My temper doesn't help anyone eat," she said. "And I went to that creek every morning for 9 years before anyone in this valley thought it was worth noticing. I didn't do it for their attention. I'm not going to stop because of it." She walked out of the store. The crisis point came on a Wednesday, the 3rd week after the swarm at 9 in the morning. Clara Bright arrived at the Carter house at a pace that told Abigail before she'd said a word that something had changed. 3 families, Clara said. The Dennisons, the Fowlers, and the old Harker couple. They've returned everything, the dried goods, the preserved jars, everything you gave them. Abigail went still. They returned them, left them at the gate. There's a note from Calvin Dennison. Clara held out a folded piece of paper. Abigail read it. Calvin Dennison's handwriting was neat and careful, and the note explained in terms that had been clearly worked over several times to sound reasonable, that he and his wife had decided out of an abundance of caution to refrain from using provisions they could not verify through official channels, and that he meant no offense to Abigail personally, but that the welfare of his children had to come before community goodwill. The welfare of his children, who were not eating anything Abigail had given them anymore. She folded the note. "How much did they return?" she said. 2 full jars of the pickled purslane, a bundle of dried nettles, a bag of the cattail flour. Enough food for a week for a family of 4. She calculated quickly. The Dennisons had 4 children between ages 3 and 12. She calculated the calorie gap. She calculated what Calvin Dennison's root cellar probably had left in it. "Go home, Clara," she said. "Abigail, I mean it. Go home and stay there this morning." She was already moving toward the kitchen. "I have work to do." She spent the rest of that morning repackaging the returned goods. She removed every trace of the Carter identification from the jars and bundles. She put them in a plain cloth sack. And that afternoon, she left the sack at the gate of a family she knew was quietly struggling, a widow on the East Road named Pauline Hennessy Bill's older sister, who had not come to any meetings and had not spoken to Abigail directly, but who Abigail knew from 7 years of living in the same valley, was too proud to ask for anything and too private to accept anything from someone she knew. She left it at the gate and walked away. What she could not walk away from was what happened 3 days later. It started with a sound she heard from inside the house, voices more than one somewhere near the property line. She came out to find 3 men she knew by name, but not well, the Pruitt cousins from the North Road, the ones who ran the cattle operation near the ridge, standing at the gate, talking to Samuel, and the tone was wrong before she could make out the words. She walked toward them. One of the cousins, Len Pruitt, the older one, a broad man with a deliberate way of holding himself that communicated authority whether or not he intended it, looked at her as she came close. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. "We wanted to have a word with your husband about the situation with the Valley's food supply." "You can have that word with me," she said, "since I'm the one who manages the Valley's food supply." Len Pruitt's eyes moved briefly to Samuel. Samuel did not move. "We've been hearing from some of the other families," Len said, "that there's concern about what's being distributed. We'd like to know what's in those jars, specifically, what's actually in them." "Preserved purslane in a wild brine," Abigail said. "Dried lamb's quarters, cattail flour, nettle tea. If you want the precise contents of any specific jar, I'll tell you." "We'd like it written down," Len said, "so we can show it to someone with proper knowledge of these things." "I am someone with proper knowledge of these things," she said. "We mean a doctor, Mrs. Carter." His voice was not unkind. That was what made it harder. "No offense intended to you personally. I know you don't mean offense personally," she said. "I know you're doing what seems careful and reasonable when you're afraid. I understand it." She looked at him steadily. "But I need to ask you something. What are your children eating today?" A pause. "We've been managing," Len said. "With what?" A shorter pause. "We've been the root cellars not entirely depleted," he said. "How much longer?" she said. His jaw worked. He didn't answer. 3 weeks, she said. 2, 1, silence. "If you want a written list of contents," she said, "I'll give you one right now. Get me a piece of paper." She looked at Len Pruitt without moving her eyes. "And when the doctor comes from 40 miles away and reads that list and tells you it's safe, your children will have been not eating for however long that takes. So you make the choice you can live with. I'll make the list either way." Len Pruitt looked at his cousin. His cousin looked at the ground. "No," Len said. "No, that won't be necessary." He put his hat back on. "We appreciate what you've done," he said. "And we wanted you to know that despite some of the talk, we're not against you, Mrs. Carter." "I know that," she said. "You're just afraid." He nodded. He and his cousin turned and walked back down the lane. Samuel waited until they were out of earshot. "You should have let me handle that," he said. She looked at him. "You were handling it fine," she said. "I just handled the part that needed a different voice." He looked at her for a moment, and then unexpectedly, something shifted across his face. Not the careful control she was used to, but something less managed than that, something close to admiration, which sat on Samuel Carter's face with the uncertain quality of an expression that didn't have much practice being there. "You're remarkable," he said. "I don't say that enough." She looked at him. "You don't say it at all," she said. I know, he said. I'm saying it now. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back toward the house. Come inside, she said. I need help with the cattail flour. The second batch is ready, and I can't do the grinding and the sorting at the same time. He followed her in. They worked side by side in the kitchen, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the kitchen smelled like dried herbs and something earthy and warm that Abigail associated with Nora Birdfeather's fire all those years ago. And she thought, as she ground the cattail pollen into flour with her hands, that knew the motion. She thought that there were worse things in a life than to be underestimated and then proven right if the proving happened while you still had the people you loved standing in the kitchen beside you. She was in the middle of that thought when the knock came at the door. Not a tentative knock, a deliberate hard knock 3 times the kind that announces itself. Samuel looked up. She looked at him. He went to the door. She heard a voice she didn't immediately recognize, a man's voice, formal, with the cadence of someone who spoke in official registers. She wiped her hands and walked to the door. Standing on the porch was a man she had never seen before. He was perhaps 50, with a physician's bag at his feet, and a coat that had come a long way in the heat. And he was holding a card he'd evidently just offered to Samuel. Dr. Henry Cass, the man said. County Health Authority. I've received a formal complaint from residents of Willow Creek Valley regarding unauthorized medical and nutritional guidance being provided without proper credentials. He looked at Abigail. I take it you're Mrs. Carter. Abigail looked at the doctor. She looked at his bag. She looked at his card, which Samuel was still holding. She thought about Martha Collins. She thought about the unsigned letters. She thought about the Dennison children with their returned jars of purslane. And then she stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. I've just finished the morning's batch of cattail flour, and there's dried nettle tea on the stove. Sit down, and I'll show you everything I have. Dr. Cass looked at her for a moment. He picked up his bag. He came inside, and what he was about to find in Abigail Carter's kitchen was going to change considerably his understanding of exactly what he had ridden 40 miles to investigate. Dr. Henry Cass set his bag down just inside the door and looked around Abigail's kitchen with the careful cataloging eyes of a man trained to notice what other people missed. He took in the rafters hung with bundles of drying herbs, the row of jars on the shelf above the stove, the basket of fresh-picked greens still sitting on the counter where Abigail had left them when the knock came. You've been busy, he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite anything yet. 11 years of practice tends to look like that, Abigail said. Sit down, Dr. Cass. The tea's still hot. He didn't sit immediately. He walked to the counter and looked at the greens, turning one leaf over with a finger, the gesture of a man who had been trained to identify plants in some formal capacity once and was testing whether that training still worked. Lamb's quarters, he said half to himself. Abigail's eyebrows lifted slightly. You know it. I know it's edible. I didn't expect to find it on a kitchen counter being treated like a staple crop. He looked up at her. Mrs. Carter, I received a written complaint signed by 4 residents of this valley alleging that you have been distributing unidentified plant matter to families including children without any verification of safety, and that this practice may have contributed to at least 1 case of serious illness in a minor. The Wheeler boy, Abigail said. That's the case referenced, yes. He had a waterborne fever from contaminated runoff on the south branch of the creek, she said. Cattle had been penned in the field above it. I treated him with clean boiled water and dried elderberry, and his fever broke within 6 hours of when I arrived. He's been fully recovered for 2 weeks. You're welcome to examine him yourself. His mother, Mary Wheeler, lives a 15-minute walk from here, and she'll tell you the same thing I just did in considerably more emotional terms. Dr. Cass studied her. You sound very certain, he said. I am certain, she said. Sit down, please. You rode 40 miles. At least let your legs rest while I show you what's actually in those jars you came to investigate. He sat. She poured him a cup of the nettle tea without asking and set it in front of him, and he looked at it with the same suspicious scrutiny he'd given the lamb's quarters, and then apparently deciding that suspicion without action was a poor use of a 40-mile ride he drank. He made a small sound of surprise. "It's not unpleasant," he said, as if this fact troubled him slightly. "Most people expect it to taste like punishment," Abigail said. "It surprises them when it doesn't." She sat down across from him and began methodically without flourish to walk him through everything. She brought down jar after jar from the shelf and named each one pickled purslane in a wild brine of vinegar and juniper berry, dried lamb's quarters that rehydrated into something close to spinach cattail flour, ground fine enough to bake with wild onion preserved in its own reduction nettle, dried for tea, and also separately dried and crushed for use as a flour additive rich in iron. She told him where each plant grew in the valley, how to identify it correctly, what its dangerous lookalikes were, and how to distinguish them, how long each preparation kept, and what she'd learned about safe quantities through 11 years of feeding herself her husband, and now half the valley. Dr. Cass listened without interrupting for nearly 40 minutes. Then he set down his cup and looked at her with an expression that had changed considerably from the one he'd worn at the door. "Where did you learn this?" he said. "All of this. This isn't folk superstition, Mrs. Carter. This is—" He paused, searching for the right framing. "This is closer to a working botanical pharmacology than anything I expected to find in a ranch kitchen. I learned it from a Cherokee healer named Nora Birdfeather," Abigail said. "I was 16. I got lost in the hills north of the reservation during a hunting trip with my father, and I was alone for 2 days before she found me. I had a fever from exposure and a leg wound that had gone bad. She kept me alive for 3 days using exactly what you've just seen on this counter, and then she kept teaching me for the next 4 years every time my family could spare me to visit, because she said I had hands that listened." Dr. Cass was quiet for a moment. "Hands that listened," he repeated. "Her words," Abigail said. "Not mine. I didn't understand what she meant until much later." "And you understand it now." "I understand that some people see a plant and see a weed," Abigail said. "And some people see a plant and see a question. What does it want? What does it need to grow here and not there? What does that tell you about the soil, the water, the season? Nora taught me to ask the question instead of assuming the answer." She looked at him steadily. "Most of what's killed people in this country isn't ignorance, Dr. Cass. It's certainty. People being certain about things they never actually examined." Dr. Cass looked at his hands around the teacup for a long moment. "I came here," he said slowly, "fully prepared to find a well-meaning but dangerously misinformed woman feeding a community on guesswork." He looked up. "I did not expect to find someone who could likely teach a course at a medical college on regional toxicology and nutrition. I have no use for compliments, Dr. Cass," Abigail said. "I have use for you writing down formally in whatever document satisfies the people who sent that complaint that what I'm doing is safe. Because there are children in this valley right now whose parents pulled their food away out of fear, and fear doesn't feed anybody." Dr. Cass reached for his bag. He pulled out paper and inkwell, a pen, and began writing. He wrote for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally pausing to ask Abigail a clarifying question: the precise preparation method for the cattail flour, the maximum safe daily quantity of the nettle preparation for children under 5, whether she had ever observed any allergic reaction to any of the plants in her catalog. She answered each question precisely, and he wrote down her answers precisely, and by the time he finished, he had produced a document that read less like a casual endorsement and more like a formal medical assessment. He signed it. He dated it. He read it back to her once, and then he set it on the table and looked at her. "I'm going to be direct with you, Mrs. Carter," he said. "I don't say this lightly. In 22 years of practicing medicine in this territory, I have seen more children die from malnutrition during hard seasons than from almost any other single cause, more than fever, more than accident. Hunger is patient. It doesn't announce itself the way a wound does. It just waits, and it wins slowly, and by the time anyone notices, it's often too late to reverse." He tapped the document. "What you've built here isn't folk remedy. It's a famine response. And it's a better one than anything currently taught in any medical institution I'm aware of, because it doesn't depend on supply lines that might not reach a valley like this one in time." Abigail was quiet. "I'd like your permission," he said, "to take notes on your methods, formally. To bring back to the Territorial Health Board. Not to take credit for it. Mrs. Carter to spread it. There are a dozen valleys like this one across the territory that could be facing exactly what you faced 3 weeks ago, and most of them don't have a woman who spent 11 years learning from a healer in the hills." Abigail looked at the document on the table. She thought about Nora Birdfeather, who had never been credited for anything in her life, who had healed strangers and neighbors and lost children for 40 years without a single official document acknowledging that her knowledge was real. "On one condition," Abigail said. "Name it. You credit Nora Birdfeather by name in whatever you write," she said. "Not as a footnote, as the source. I'm not interested in being remembered as clever. I'm interested in people understanding that the knowledge came from somewhere from someone, and that the people this territory has spent decades dismissing have been carrying the answers the whole time." Dr. Cass looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen again and added a line to the bottom of the document. He turned it around so she could read it. "The methods and knowledge documented herein originate substantially from the teachings of Nora Birdfeather, Cherokee healer, whose contribution should be recognized as foundational to this assessment." Abigail read it twice. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady when she said it. Dr. Cass left an hour later, his bag heavier with samples Abigail had insisted he take. Dried specimens of each plant carefully labeled along with written instructions for identification and preparation that she'd copied out for him in her own careful hand while he packed his other things. He shook Samuel's hand at the door. He shook Abigail's hand too, which Samuel noticed and which seemed to mean something to him that he didn't say aloud until later that night. "He shook your hand like he meant it," Samuel said once the wagon had disappeared down the lane. "He did," Abigail said. "That doesn't happen to women in this territory very often," Samuel said. "Not from men like that." "No," Abigail agreed. "It doesn't." She held the document in both hands and looked at it for a long moment before she set it down on the kitchen table in the exact spot where the anonymous letter had sat 3 weeks earlier, as though the table itself were keeping score of something. Word of Dr. Cass's visit moved through Willow Creek Valley faster than the swarm had moved across the South Ridge. By the following morning, Bill Hennessy had already heard 3 different versions of the story at his store, 2 of them wildly exaggerated, and he came to the Carter property himself at midday to get the truth from Abigail directly, because Bill Hennessy had learned over the past month that the version of events you got from Abigail tended to be the one that survived contact with reality. She showed him the document. He read it twice, his lips moving slightly as he worked through some of the more formal language, and when he finished, he looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his round, tired face before. "This is going to the Territorial Health Board," he said. "That's what he told me. Abigail." He said her name carefully like he was trying out something new. "Do you understand what this means? A county doctor just put his name on a document saying you know more about keeping people alive in a famine than most trained physicians. I understand what it means for the families who'll stop returning their jars out of fear," she said. "That's what it means to me, what it..." Bill Hennessy looked at her for a long moment, and then he laughed, not unkindly, but with the particular wonder of a man encountering something he didn't have adequate language for. "You are the strangest, most stubborn woman I have ever met," he said, "and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give." "I'll take it," she said. He left, and within 2 days the Dennisons reappeared at her gate. Calvin Dennison stood there with his hat in his hands, his wife beside him, both of their faces carrying the particular discomfort of people who know they need to say something and don't entirely know how to begin. "We heard about the doctor," Calvin said. "I figured you would," Abigail said. "We were wrong to return the jars," he said. It came out stiffly like a sentence he'd practiced and still found uncomfortable in his mouth. "We let fear get ahead of good sense. The children have been..." He stopped. His wife touched his arm. "The children have been hungry," Mrs. Dennison said quietly, finishing what her husband couldn't. "I'm sorry, Abigail. I should have trusted what I'd already seen with my own eyes instead of listening to what other people were saying." Abigail looked at the 2 of them standing at her gate, Proud people who had made a frightened decision and were now standing in the discomfort of having to walk it back. And she felt something soften in her chest, because she understood more than most people might have expected her to. How hard it was to admit you'd been wrong when admitting it cost you something in front of your neighbors. "Come in," she said. "I have fresh purslane today, and I was just about to start the bread." They came in. The bread that afternoon made with a portion of cattail flour, mixed into the regular wheat, the way Abigail had been teaching for weeks, now filled the kitchen with a smell that brought the Dennison children running in from where they'd been waiting outside, and watching them eat. Watching the youngest one ask for a second piece, before he'd finished the first, Abigail thought that this, more than any document Dr. Cass could write, was the actual proof that mattered. But it was Samuel who surprised her most in the days that followed. He had always been a careful man, a man who weighed his public actions against how they would be received. And Abigail had loved him through that carefulness for 7 years, without ever expecting it to change. But something had shifted in him since the night of the Wheeler boys' fever, and it kept shifting week by week, in ways she noticed without commenting on, because she'd learned that Samuel's transformations needed room to happen without an audience. He started coming to the morning sessions at the creek, not every morning. He had a ranch to run cattle, to manage fences, to mend all the ordinary obligations of his life that didn't pause because his wife had become in the space of a month the most consequential person in Willow Creek Valley. But 2 or 3 mornings a week, Abigail would come downstairs to find him already dressed, waiting by the door, and he would walk with her to wherever she was teaching that day, and he would stand at the edge of the group with his hat in his hands, listening. The first time Thomas Marsh noticed, he said nothing. The second time he raised an eyebrow. By the third time, Samuel was no longer standing at the edge. He was crouched beside James Bright and Harold Pruitt, sleeves rolled up, learning how to identify the difference between true sorrel and the toxic look-alike that grew in similar conditions. And Abigail watched her husband, a man who had spent years quietly wishing she would garden like other wives, kneeling in the dirt, with notable concentration, trying to get the leaf shape right. "You don't have to do this," she told him quietly one evening after he'd come home with dirt under his fingernails and a small scratch on his forearm from a thorn bush he hadn't seen. "I want to," he said. "Why?" He thought about the question seriously, the way he thought about most things that mattered to him. "Because for 7 years I thought I was the one who understood this valley," he said. "How to work it, how to read the weather, how to manage cattle through a hard winter. I was proud of that. I built my whole sense of myself around being a man who knew things." He paused. "And then the one thing none of us saw coming, the thing that could have starved every family on this land, you saw it 10 days before it happened because you'd spent 11 years paying attention to something I dismissed as foolishness." He looked at his hands. "I don't want to be a man who only respects what he already understands. I want to understand more." Abigail didn't say anything for a moment. "That's the most you've ever said to me at once," she said finally with the faint trace of a smile. "Don't get used to it," he said. But he was smiling too, and something passed between them in that moment that was different from anything that had passed between them in 7 years of marriage. Not less love than before, but a different shape of it, one built on something closer to equal ground. The morning sessions grew larger through the following 2 weeks. What had started as 4 or 5 women on a borrowed wagon had become, by the start of the next month, something closer to a standing institution. Thomas Marsh's wagon wasn't enough anymore. 2 other families had begun bringing their own. Children who'd come along reluctantly at first were now racing each other to identify plants, correctly turning Abigail's careful lessons into something resembling a game, which she encouraged because she'd learned long ago from Nora Birdfeather that knowledge a child absorbed through play stayed in the body longer than knowledge forced through repetition alone. Martha Collins kept coming. She never became warm exactly. That wasn't in her nature, and Abigail had stopped expecting it. But she became precise almost fiercely, so mastering each new plant and preparation with the focused intensity of a woman who had decided that being good at this was the only acceptable response to having been wrong about it for so long. She corrected her own children sharply when they misidentified something, and twice Abigail saw her correct other women's children too gently but firmly with an authority that suggested she had begun to think of this knowledge as something she now had a stake in protecting. "You've gotten good at this," Abigail told her one morning, after Martha walked Ruth Garner's granddaughter through the difference between true and false oxalis without a single error. Martha looked up, almost startled by the comment. "I don't do things halfway," she said. "Whatever I decide to do." "I've noticed," Abigail said. Martha studied her for a moment. "I'm not going to thank you," she said. "Not out loud. Not where people can hear it and make something of it." "I didn't ask you to," Abigail said. "I know." Martha turned back to the plants in front of her. "That's the only reason I can stand to be here." It wasn't friendship. Abigail understood that. But it was something, a recalibration, a quiet accounting that Martha Collins was doing internally, on her own terms, in her own time. And Abigail had learned enough from Nora Birdfeather's patience to know that some transformations couldn't be rushed and shouldn't be demanded. They had to be allowed to happen at their own pace, the way a plant grows toward light without anyone instructing it to. The real turning point, the one that would later get told and retold in Willow Creek Valley for years long after the details of the swarm itself had faded into the general texture of local history, came on a Sunday afternoon in late August, at what started as an ordinary gathering and became something else entirely. It began with Reverend Whitfield, the Valley's minister, a thoughtful man in his 60s who had watched the entire unfolding crisis from a slight remove, offering prayers and comfort, but staying carefully out of the practical disputes that had consumed the valley for weeks. He approached Abigail after the Sunday service, his hat in his hands, with the particular hesitancy of a man about to ask for something he wasn't certain he had the right to ask for. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I wonder if I might impose on you for something." "You can ask," Abigail said. "The Harvest Festival," he said. "We hold one every September, as you know has done for as long as the valley's been settled. It's meant to celebrate what's been grown. Given what's happened this year—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I wonder if it might be appropriate this year to celebrate something different. Or rather, to celebrate the same thing through a different lens." Abigail waited. "I'd like you to speak," he said. "At the festival. Not as an oddity, not as a curiosity for people to gawk at. As someone the valley owes a genuine debt." He looked at her steadily. "I should have offered this earlier. I let my own discomfort with conflict keep me from saying publicly what I believed privately, and that's a failing I intend to correct." Abigail considered this. "I'm not someone who likes standing in front of crowds, Reverend," she said. "I understand that," he said. "But I think there are people in this valley who need to hear directly from you, in a setting that isn't a complaint hearing or a kitchen lesson, what you believe about what's happened here. I think it would do something for this community that nothing else quite can." Samuel, standing nearby, caught her eye. "You don't have to," he said quietly. She looked at her husband. She looked at the Reverend. She thought about Nora Birdfeather, who had spent 40 years healing this territory's people without ever once being asked to stand in front of a crowd and be thanked for it. And she thought that perhaps this was not entirely about her. Perhaps it was about making sure the next Nora Birdfeather, whoever and wherever she might be, would not have to wait 40 years and a famine before anyone thought to listen. "I'll speak," Abigail said. The Reverend's relief was visible. "Thank you," he said. "I mean that sincerely." The Harvest Festival fell on the second Saturday of September, and by midday, the church grounds were filled with nearly every family in the valley. Long tables set up under the open sky, dishes brought from every kitchen, and Abigail noted with a private satisfaction, she didn't show on her face, that at least half the dishes on those tables now included something that 3 months earlier would have been called a weed. Eleanor Marsh had made a bread with cattail flour folded into it. Agnes Pruitt had brought a large pot of stewed greens that disappeared within the first hour. Even Martha Collins, standing stiffly near her own table, had brought a dish of pickled purslane that she'd clearly made with considerable care. And when people complimented it, she accepted the compliments with a controlled but genuine pride that Abigail recognized because she'd seen the same pride form slowly in dozens of women over the past month. Reverend Whitfield called for quiet around 2 in the afternoon, and the valley gathered loosely in front of the small platform that had been built for occasions exactly like this one, and Abigail stood beside Samuel, feeling something she rarely felt, which was nervous. "I'm not going to give a long speech," she said once the crowd had settled, and the Reverend had introduced her with words more generous than she felt entirely comfortable accepting. "I've never been one for long speeches, and most of you have heard me talk more in the last month than in the previous 7 years combined, so I expect you're due for a rest from the sound of my voice." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. It loosened something in her chest. "What I want to say is simple," she continued. "What saved this valley wasn't me. I want to be clear about that because I think there's a temptation now that the crisis has passed to turn this into a story about one person who knew something special. That's not what happened here." She looked out at the faces in front of her. Mary Wheeler with her recovered son standing beside her, Ruth Garner with her sharp, attentive eyes, Thomas Marsh with his arms crossed and his face carefully neutral in the way it always was when he was moved by something. What saved this valley was every single person who was willing to walk to a creek at dawn and learn something that scared them a little, because pride is a luxury that hunger doesn't allow you to keep. What saved this valley was women admitting they'd been wrong in front of their neighbors, which is one of the hardest things a person can do. What saved this valley was men who'd spent their whole lives believing that real knowledge only comes from books and trained authorities kneeling in the dirt to learn from a teacher their pride had told them for years to dismiss. She paused. The crowd was very quiet. "I learned everything I taught you from a woman named Nora Birdfeather," she said. "A Cherokee healer who saved my life when I was 16 years old, lost and fevered in the hills, and who spent the next 4 years teaching me everything she knew, asking nothing in return, except that I pay attention. She is not here today. She passed 3 winters ago in the hills where she'd lived her whole life, and as far as I know, in 70 years of healing strangers and neighbors and saving more lives than anyone in this valley will ever be able to count. She was never once thanked publicly in front of a crowd the way you're thanking me today." Her voice caught slightly, and she let it because there was no use pretending otherwise. "I think about that often. I think about how much knowledge this territory has walked past generation after generation, because the people carrying it didn't look like what we expected wisdom to look like. I'm not asking you to feel guilty about that. I'm asking you to remember it. The next time someone in this valley does something a little strange, walks a little differently, knows something nobody else bothered to learn, I'm asking you to wonder before you laugh whether they might be the one who's actually paying attention." She stopped. She hadn't planned to say that much. She looked at Samuel, who was watching her with an expression that had nothing careful left in it at all. The applause that followed wasn't the polite kind. It went on long enough that Abigail felt her face heat with an embarrassment she hadn't anticipated, and Reverend Whitfield had to raise his hands twice before the crowd settled enough for him to speak again. What happened next, nobody had planned, which made it land harder than anything that had been planned could have. Martha Collins walked up to the platform. The crowd's noise dropped to nothing. Abigail watched her come, watched the careful, deliberate way she moved. The same way she'd moved through every interaction since the church hall meeting weeks earlier, composed on the surface, working hard underneath. Martha stopped in front of the platform and looked up at Abigail. "I owe you an apology," she said. Her voice carried clearly across the silent gathering. "Not a quiet one. Not one whispered at your gate so nobody has to witness it." She swallowed. "I spent years mocking you. I called your basket an embarrassment. I told people you lived like an animal foraging at the creek instead of keeping a proper garden, like a proper wife. And when this valley needed exactly what you'd spent 11 years preparing for, my first instinct wasn't gratitude. It was fear, and I let that fear turn into accusations that could have cost you everything you'd built and could have cost children in this valley their safety, because I was too proud to admit I didn't understand something." She looked down for the moment, then back up. "My children ate from your kitchen for 3 weeks while I was telling people you couldn't be trusted," she said. "I am not a woman who finds it easy to say I was wrong. I expect most of you know that about me already." A faint, unexpected laugh moved through part of the crowd, and Martha's mouth twitched almost a smile. "But I was wrong. Thoroughly. And I'm standing here because my children deserve to see their mother say so, where everyone can hear it the same way everyone heard the other things I said." Abigail came down from the platform. She stood in front of Martha Collins, the two of them facing each other in front of the entire valley, years of friction and mockery and fear, compressed into the space between them, and Abigail extended her hand. Martha looked at it. Then she took it and shook it firm and brief, the handshake of two women who had found their way to something neither of them would have predicted 3 months earlier. And the crowd's applause this time was different from before. Warmer, looser, the sound of an entire community exhaling something it had been holding for weeks. Samuel found her an hour later, after the crowd had loosened into smaller conversations, and the long tables had been mostly emptied of food. "You did well today," he said. "I said too much," she said. "I never meant to talk about Nora like that in front of everyone." "It was the most important part of what you said," Samuel said. "I watched their faces. They needed to hear it." She looked out at the valley, at Ruth Garner deep in conversation with Eleanor Marsh, at Agnes Pruitt's children chasing the Wheeler boy across the grass, at Martha Collins sitting at a table with her own children, talking with an animation Abigail had genuinely never witnessed in her before. And she felt something settle in her chest that she didn't have an exact word for. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to a debt finally being acknowledged, even if it could never be fully repaid. "Nora would have hated all this attention," she said. "Would she?" Samuel asked. Abigail thought about it. "No," she admitted after a moment. "She would have pretended to hate it, and then asked me 3 separate times to describe exactly what everyone said." Samuel laughed a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she didn't hear from him often enough. "Then I suppose today would have made her happy," he said. "I suppose it would have," Abigail said. They stood together, watching the valley settle into its late afternoon rhythms, the long light falling gold across the grass, the sound of children's laughter carrying from somewhere near the creek. And neither of them said anything else for a long while, because there are some moments that don't need more words added to them. There are moments that simply need to be stood inside of quietly, while a person lets them become part of what they carry forward. But even as the festival wound down, even as families began loading wagons and walking children home in the long evening light, Abigail understood something she hadn't said aloud to anyone, not even Samuel. What had happened in Willow Creek Valley this summer was not finished. Knowledge that had been earned this hard, paid for with fear and hunger and humbled pride, had a way of either taking deep root or slipping away the moment the crisis that had forced it stopped being urgent. She had watched it happen before, in smaller ways, in other communities Nora had told her about. Over the years, people who learned out of desperation, and then, the moment desperation passed, let the learning fade back into convenience and forgetting. She did not intend to let that happen here. Winter was still months away, but Abigail Carter had already begun thinking quietly about how to make sure that what this valley had learned this summer didn't disappear the way fear always wanted hard-earned knowledge to disappear, buried under the comfortable assumption that the worst was over and would never come again. The first frost came earlier than anyone in Willow Creek Valley remembered it ever coming, settling over the grass one October morning with a hard silvery bite that told every rancher in the territory that the coming winter was going to test them in ways the late summer's beetle swarm had only hinted at. Abigail stood at her kitchen window before dawn, watching her own breath fog against the glass, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel after everything the valley had already survived together. She felt ready. That feeling had not arrived by accident. It had arrived because for 6 weeks straight, since the Harvest Festival, since Martha Collins's apology in front of the whole gathered valley, Abigail had been working at something larger than teaching individual families how to forage and preserve. She had been building with help. She hadn't fully expected to receive something that would outlast her. Something that wouldn't depend on any one person remembering to keep showing up at a creek at first light. Thomas Marsh found her in the kitchen that frosty morning, knocking twice before letting himself in, the way he'd taken to doing over the past month, a habit Samuel had granted him without comment, which told Abigail everything she needed to know about how thoroughly Thomas Marsh had earned his way into the rhythm of the Carter household. "Frost came hard," he said, stamping the cold out of his boots. "It did," Abigail said. "Sit. There's coffee, and there's the last of the dried huckleberry if you want something sweeter." He sat. He took the huckleberry without being offered twice. "I've been thinking about what you said at the festival," he said around a mouthful. "About not letting this slip back into how things were." Abigail looked at him with interest. Thomas Marsh did not usually open conversations with his own thoughts. He usually arrived already decided about something and announced the decision plainly, which was one of the things she'd come to respect about him. "What have you been thinking?" she said. "I've been thinking we need a building," he said. "Not your kitchen, not forever anyway. Something central. Somewhere families can come learn store-dried goods communally for emergencies, somewhere the knowledge doesn't live and die with you walking out to that creek every morning." Abigail set down her cup. "You've been thinking about this a while," she said. "Since the Harvest Festival," he admitted. "I talked to James Bright, Harold Pruitt, even Robert Collins, if you can believe that." He paused. "Robert wants to make up for organizing that meeting that nearly cost you everything. He offered the old grain storage building behind the church. It's not being used for much besides spiders these days." Abigail considered this carefully. She thought about the structure of what they'd built so far, informal, dependent on her energy, her memory, her availability. She thought about what would happen if she got sick one winter or worse. She thought about Nora Birdfeather, whose entire body of knowledge had nearly died with her in those hills preserved only because one frightened 16-year-old girl had paid close enough attention to carry it forward. She did not want Willow Creek Valley's survival to depend on a single thread that thin ever again. "I want more than a storage building," she said slowly. "I want a place where the knowledge gets written down, recorded, where it doesn't live only in my hands and my memory." Thomas Marsh leaned back. "Go on." "I want every plant we use cataloged properly," she said. "Drawn described where it grows when it's ready, how to prepare it, what it can be confused with, what happens if you get it wrong. I want children learning to read it the way they learn their letters. I want it written down so thoroughly that if I dropped dead tomorrow, this valley would never have to relearn what it took me 11 years and Nora 40 years before that to understand." Thomas Marsh was quiet for a long moment, turning this over with the same careful deliberation he brought to evaluating cattle or weather or any other thing that mattered to him. "That's a bigger job than a storage shed," he said finally. "I know. You'll need more than my wagon for that. I know that too." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Then let's build it bigger." Word moved through the valley the way it always moved now. Not through gossip and fear, the way it had moved in July, but through purpose, family by family, each one adding something. James Bright, who had built drying racks for half the valley by now, without being asked twice, offered to construct proper shelving inside the old grain building. Eleanor Marsh, who had a fine hand for lettering, and had once kept the church's records before her eyesight, made the fine work difficult, offered to help with labeling, once the cataloging began squinting through her spectacles with a determination that made Abigail's chest tighten every time she watched her work. And then, in a turn that surprised absolutely everyone except perhaps Abigail herself, who had been watching the slow transformation happen for weeks, Martha Collins arrived at the Carter property one afternoon with a stack of paper under her arm and an expression of fierce, focused purpose. "I want to help write it down," she said without any preamble at all. "The catalog, whatever you're calling it." Abigail looked at her. "You have good penmanship," she said. "I've noticed it in your harvest dish labels." "I have excellent penmanship," Martha said, with the first trace of real pride Abigail had heard from her in months. "And I've been the one keeping track of which plants make my children sick to their stomach, and which ones don't in more detail than anyone else in this valley because I needed to be certain. So I already half have this catalog started whether you knew it or not." She set the stack of paper on the table. Abigail looked through it. Martha Collins had over the preceding 2 months kept a meticulous private record: dates, plants, preparations, reactions, growing locations marked with small hand-drawn maps of her own property and the surrounding hillside. It was unpolished in places, written in the cramped, urgent hand of someone working it out for herself rather than for an audience, but it was thorough in a way that made Abigail's estimation of Martha rise sharply and permanently. "This is good work," Abigail said. Martha's jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when she was absorbing praise she didn't quite know how to hold. "I told you I don't do things halfway," she said. "You didn't tell me you'd been doing this," Abigail said. "I wasn't doing it to show anyone," Martha said. "I was doing it because I needed to trust what I was feeding my own children, and trusting someone else's word wasn't enough for me. I had to see it for myself, written down, organized, proven." She looked at Abigail directly. "I imagine that's not so different from what you've spent your whole life doing." Abigail felt something close to a laugh rise in her chest. "No," she said. "It's not so different at all." They began the cataloging in earnest the following week in the old grain storage building that James Bright had already begun fitting with proper shelves, and what started as Abigail and Martha working at a single table soon grew into something larger, the way everything connected to that summer's crisis had grown larger than its original shape. Ruth Garner came to help with collecting and pressing plant specimens, her sharp eyes proving remarkably suited to the detail work. Clara Bright, whose husband had built half the drying racks in the valley, brought her own steady hand to drawing illustrations of each plant, careful enough that even someone who'd never set foot in Willow Creek Valley could use her drawings to identify a stem of lamb's quarters from a dangerous look-alike. Even Agnes Pruitt, with her 9 children and her endless responsibilities, found an hour here and there to come sit and recite from memory every preparation Abigail had ever taught her, so that Eleanor Marsh could write it down in her careful, deliberate hand. By the middle of November, they had completed entries for over 40 distinct plants. Their seasons, their uses, their dangers, their preparations bound into a single growing volume that Thomas Marsh had taken to calling, half joking and half in earnest, the Willow Creek Book. It was Samuel who suggested one evening, as the two of them sat by the fire with the cold pressing hard against the windows, that they needed more than one copy. "What if something happens to it?" he said. "Fire, flood, anything. All that work gone in an afternoon." Abigail looked at him. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I think about a great many things now that I never used to think about," Samuel said, and there was a quiet humor in it, an acknowledgement of how far he'd traveled from the man who'd once wished in his more embarrassed moments that his wife would simply tend a normal garden like everyone else. "What do you propose?" she asked. "Copies," he said. "More than one, kept in different places. The church, the Marsh place. Maybe even sent to that Dr. Cass, so the Territorial Health Board has their own record the way he wanted in the first place." He paused. Knowledge that only exists in one place is knowledge that's one bad day away from disappearing. Abigail thought of Nora Birdfeather again, as she so often did these days, of all those decades of careful, patient learning that had so nearly vanished into the hills with her, saved only by the chance that one frightened, fevered girl had been paying close enough attention. "You're right," she said. "We'll make copies, as many as it takes." The work of copying fell to whoever had the steadiest hand and the most patience, and it gave Eleanor Marsh in particular a sense of purpose. Abigail had not seen in her before the woman who'd once mocked Abigail's basket, now spent entire evenings by lamplight, carefully transcribing page after page, her failing eyesight notwithstanding, because she had decided in her own quiet way that this was penance worth paying in full. December brought the first real test of everything they'd built. A blizzard rolled down off the mountains in the second week of the month, the kind of storm old-timers in the valley would later describe as the worst in a generation, burying roads under drifts taller than a grown man, trapping families in their homes for the better part of a week. It was the sort of storm that in ordinary years left at least one family in the valley dangerously short on supplies by the time the roads cleared, sometimes worse than short. This year was different. When the snow finally broke enough for Thomas Marsh to get his wagon moving again, he made his way first to the Carter property, Not because there was an emergency, but because he wanted Abigail to see something with her own eyes. "Come with me," he said. "There's something you should witness." She rode with him through the cleared sections of road the world still blanketed in white smoke, curling steadily from every chimney they passed, and at each house they stopped. Thomas Marsh asked the same question he'd been asking for weeks now, ever since the catalog work had begun in earnest. "How are you faring on stores?" And at house after house the answer was the same. The Wheelers had dried cattail flour and preserved purslane stacked alongside their regular root cellar goods, enough to weather another 2 weeks if the storm had somehow continued. Ruth Garner alone at the end of the North Road had her own small but carefully organized stockpile, neat as anything Abigail had ever taught enough that she'd waved off Thomas Marsh's offer of extra supplies with the brisk pride of a woman who had learned to take care of herself and intended to keep doing so. Even the Dennisons, who had once returned their jars out of fear, had a full season's worth of dried goods that Calvin Dennison showed off with something close to relief in his voice. "We didn't even think twice about it this year," he told Abigail, standing in his doorway with the cold biting at both of them. "We just did what the book said. Dried it in August like it told us to. Didn't even need the cellar to be full of regular crops because we had this besides." Abigail looked at Thomas Marsh. "You wanted me to see this," she said. "I wanted you to see what you built," he said, "not what you taught one summer out of crisis, what's still standing months later when the crisis is supposed to be forgotten." Abigail felt something thick rise in her throat that she didn't immediately have words for. The valley had not forgotten. It had not slipped back into convenience the way she'd feared it might once the immediate danger of that July swarm had faded into memory. It had instead taken root quietly, steadily, the way the plants themselves grew without fanfare, simply persisting because the conditions for their persistence had been properly tended. That night, back at the Carter house with the fire crackling and Samuel beside her, Abigail allowed herself for the first time in months to simply sit with what had happened, rather than thinking immediately about what needed to happen next. "You're quiet tonight," Samuel said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About," she considered how to put it into words. "About how a thing that starts because everyone's afraid can turn into a thing that holds steady, because people decided to actually believe in it," she said. "I wasn't certain that would happen. I hoped for it. I worked toward it. But I wasn't certain." Samuel reached over and took her hand, an easy, unself-conscious gesture that would have surprised the Samuel of a year earlier, who had measured every public display of affection against what the neighbors might think of it. "I wasn't certain either," he admitted. "Not at first. I'll be honest with you, Abigail. There were mornings in July when I still half wished you'd just tend a regular garden and let the valley think what it wanted to think." He paused. "I'm ashamed of that now, but it's true, and I think you deserve the truth of it rather than a tidier version." "I know it's true," Abigail said. "I've known it for years. It didn't stop me from loving you." "I know," he said. "That's part of what humbles me most about all of this. You never needed me to come around. You just kept walking to that creek every morning whether I understood it or not, whether the valley respected it or not. You didn't wait for permission to be exactly who you were." Abigail looked at her husband in the firelight, and she thought about how far they'd both traveled since that morning in July, when he'd asked her carefully, almost apologetically, whether she might gather her things a little earlier, before people were up. "I'm not interested in being thanked for that, Samuel," she said. "I never was. I just didn't know how to be anyone other than who I already was." "I know that now," he said. "It took me embarrassingly long to understand it, but I understand it now." Winter deepened through January, and the Willow Creek book, as it had come to be known throughout the valley, and increasingly beyond it, kept growing. Dr. Cass returned in February this time, not to investigate a complaint, but to request formally on behalf of the Territorial Health Board a complete copy of the catalog to distribute to other struggling communities across the territory. He brought with him a letter from the board itself, thanking Abigail by name, and Nora Birdfeather by name, as well exactly as he'd promised he would. "There are at least 6 other valleys I know of," he told Abigail, sitting once again at her kitchen table. facing exactly the kind of crisis Willow Creek faced last summer. Crop failures, pest swarms, drought. Most of them don't have anyone like you. But if they have this book, he tapped the bound pages in front of him. They'll have something close to it. It's not the same as having someone who spent 11 years learning the land with her own hands, Abigail said. No. Dr. Cass agreed. It's not the same. But it's a start. And a start is considerably more than most of those communities have right now. Abigail thought about that for a long moment. Tell them, she said finally, that the book is only the beginning. Tell them they need someone in each valley willing to walk out to their own creek, their own hillside, and learn what's specific to their own land. The plants change. The conditions change. What grows true in Willow Creek won't grow exactly the same 40 miles east. The book can teach them how to look. It can't do the looking for them. Dr. Cass wrote that down too carefully in the margin of his own notes. By spring, when the snow finally retreated, and the valley began its slow thaw into green Willow Creek, had become, without anyone quite planning for it to happen this way, something of a destination. Word had traveled through Dr. Cass's reports to the territorial board, through ranchers who'd heard the story secondhand at cattle auctions and trading posts, through the simple, unglamorous mechanism of people talking about something remarkable that had happened in a small valley. Most of them had never previously had reason to think about. Families began arriving that spring, some from as far as 60 miles away, asking to see the methods Abigail Carter had used to keep an entire valley fed through a famine that should have, by every reasonable expectation, broken it. Abigail did not turn them away. She organized what eventually became regular seasonal gatherings, spring foraging walks along the creek, much the way the very first lessons with Margaret Henley and Agnes Pruitt and Ruth Garner had begun. Except now there might be 30 or 40 people gathered at the trailhead, instead of 4 or 5. She taught visiting ranchers how to identify the plants specific to their own land, careful always to remind them that the book was a beginning and not a substitute for paying their own close attention. Samuel increasingly stood beside her at these gatherings, not as an observer anymore, but as a genuine participant capable now of identifying a dozen plants on site and explaining their preparation with the easy confidence of a man who had put in the hours to actually learn something rather than simply admire it from a respectable distance. Martha Collins, to everyone's continued astonishment, became one of the valley's most sought-after teachers of the cataloging method itself. Visitors from other communities often found themselves seated across from her at the long table in the old grain building, watching her demonstrate with brisk, exacting precision exactly how to document a plant thoroughly enough that someone 40 miles away who had never set foot in Willow Creek could use the entry to keep their own family safe. I never expected this, Martha admitted to Abigail one afternoon, watching a young woman from a neighboring county carefully copy down her notes on wild onion preservation. Teaching strangers. Being asked for my opinion on something. I spent most of my life being asked for my opinion on other people's behavior, never on anything I actually knew how to do. You know how to do quite a lot, it turns out, Abigail said. I know how to be thorough, Martha said. I've always known that about myself. I just never had anything worth being thorough about before. She looked at Abigail. You gave me that. I don't think I ever said it plainly enough. You said it plainly enough at the Harvest Festival, Abigail said. In front of the whole valley. I don't need you to say it again. Martha almost smiled. No, she said. I suppose I did, didn't I? It was in early June, nearly a full year after the morning Abigail had first noticed the birds had gone silent along the eastern stretch of the creek, that the Willow Creek Agricultural Society, a newly formed body that had grown directly out of that first informal gathering of frightened women on Thomas Marsh's borrowed wagon, held its first formal meeting in the renovated grain building, now properly outfitted with shelving, a stove, long tables and walls lined with Clara Bright's careful illustrations of every plant cataloged in the book. Reverend Whitfield opened the meeting as he had the Harvest Festival the previous September. But this time he kept his remarks brief, because everyone understood whose words the room had actually gathered to hear. Abigail stood at the front of the room she had once never imagined existing, looking out at faces that had transformed over the course of a single difficult year from skeptics and mockers into students and, in several cases, teachers in their own right. She saw Mary Wheeler, her boy now, a sturdy, healthy 6-year-old, sitting beside her, fidgeting with the restless energy of a child who'd long since forgotten he'd ever been sick. She saw Ruth Garner, sharp-eyed and upright as ever, now widely regarded as one of the Valley's foremost experts on root preservation. She saw Eleanor Marsh, her eyesight no better than it had been, but her hand steadier than ever, from months of careful practice, sitting with the satisfied posture of a woman who had found genuine purpose in repairing what pride had once cost her. She saw Martha Collins in the front row, upright, attentive, no longer composed out of fear, but out of genuine investment in everything the room represented. And she saw Samuel standing near the back as he always did now, not because he felt out of place, but because he'd taken to positioning himself where he could watch the whole room's reaction, the way a man watches something he's deeply proud of. A year ago, Abigail said, "I walked to that creek the same way I'd walked there every morning for 9 years before that, and I noticed the birds had gone quiet, and I had no idea that within 2 weeks, every garden in this valley would be gone." She paused. "I want to tell you something I haven't said publicly before. I was afraid that summer, not of the Beatles, of all of you. I was afraid that even with everything I knew, everything Nora Birdfeather had spent 4 years teaching me, it wouldn't be enough to convince a valley that had spent years thinking of me as peculiar to trust what I was offering. I was afraid you'd rather go hungry than admit that the woman with the strange basket might have been right about something all along." The room was very quiet. "I was wrong to be afraid of that," she continued, "not because the fear wasn't reasonable. Pride is a powerful thing, and I understood exactly how much some of you would have to set aside to walk through my kitchen door. But I underestimated this valley. I underestimated how many of you, when it actually mattered, when your children were actually hungry, would choose to learn something uncomfortable rather than protect a comfortable assumption." She looked out at them. "That's the real story of this past year. Not that one woman knew something useful. It's that an entire valley, faced with losing everything it had built its identity around, chose curiosity over pride. Chose to learn rather than to keep believing the same comfortable stories about who deserved respect and who didn't." She let that settle for a moment. "The book we've built together," she said, gesturing to the shelves lined with copies, each one painstakingly transcribed by hand, "is not mine. It never was, not really. It started with Nora Birdfeather, who carried this knowledge through decades when nobody thought to write any of it down, who could have let it die with her in those hills, and instead chose to pour it into one frightened 16-year-old girl, because something in her decided the knowledge deserved to continue. It grew through every woman who walked to that creek with me, even when her neighbors mocked her for it. It grew through every man who knelt in the dirt to learn something he'd spent his whole life dismissing. It grew through Martha Collins' stubborn insistence on writing down every detail until she trusted it herself. It grew through Eleanor Marsh's failing eyes and steady hands, copying page after page by lamplight, because she'd decided that was the way she wanted to make things right. She paused once more, looking out at the room, at the faces of people who had fought her, doubted her, mocked her, and then when it mattered most had chosen something better than all of that. "What we have now," she said, "isn't survival anymore. It's something sturdier than survival. It's a valley that knows in its bones that the land beneath its feet has always offered more than what's deliberately planted in straight rows, if people are only willing to look and to admit when they've been looking past something valuable their whole lives." She looked toward the back of the room, toward Samuel, who met her eyes steadily. "A year ago, my husband asked me gently if I might gather my basket a little earlier before the neighbors were awake to see me," she said. "He wasn't a cruel man for asking that. He was a man shaped by a world that taught him respectability mattered more than truth. I want to say in front of all of you that he has since become one of the most devoted students this valley has produced, and I am prouder of that transformation than almost anything else that's happened this past year, because it proves that even deeply held assumptions can be unlearned when a person is brave enough to actually try." Samuel's jaw tightened with visible emotion, and he gave a single small nod, which from him in front of an entire room was as close to an open declaration as Abigail had ever witnessed from her husband. "I don't have a grand conclusion to offer you," Abigail said, bringing her remarks toward their close. "I'm not a woman who deals in grand conclusions. I deal in plants that grow where you don't expect them, in knowledge that survives only if someone bothers to pass it forward in the simple, unglamorous discipline of paying attention to what's actually in front of you instead of what you've been told to expect." She looked around the room one final time. "What I can tell you with complete certainty is this: no family in Willow Creek Valley starved this past year. Not one. Not because a miracle saved us. Because we chose together after a difficult and humbling reckoning to stop ignoring what the land had been offering us all along." She stepped back from the front of the room. The applause that followed was not loud or theatrical. It was steady, sustained, the unhurried sound of a community that had earned through real cost and real change the right to feel proud of what it had become. Years later, when people from other territories asked about Willow Creek Valley, about the agricultural society that had become by then a model, studied and replicated across half a dozen neighboring counties, about the famous catalog of wild edible plants that travelers sometimes specifically diverted their routes to study, the story that got told was rarely complicated. It was usually some version of the simplest possible truth: a woman everyone had mocked had spent 11 years quietly learning what the land could offer, and when disaster struck, and every carefully planted garden failed her, knowledge was the only harvest left standing. But the people of Willow Creek Valley itself, the ones who had actually lived through that hard summer and the harder winter that followed, knew the fuller truth. The one that mattered more in the long run than any single woman's foresight. They knew that wisdom dismissed as strangeness could still save an entire community if that community was willing, even at the painful cost of admitting its own pride had been misplaced, to finally start paying attention. Abigail Carter still walked to the creek every morning exactly as she always had, her basket worn soft with use. Her eyes still sharp for whatever small signs the land might be quietly offering before anyone else thought to notice them. She never asked for recognition, never sought the credit that history would eventually imperfectly try to give her. She simply kept walking, kept watching, kept teaching whoever was willing to learn, because that in the end was the whole of what she had ever wanted. Not to be celebrated for being right, but to make certain that no family in her valley would ever again have to face hunger because the knowledge that could have saved them had been dismissed as something beneath their notice. And in Willow Creek Valley, for every generation that followed, the wild plants along the creek were never again called weeds.